They said the rope went quiet the moment his feet left the crate. No last scream, no begging for mercy. Just the creak of old wood, the snap of stretched hemp, and a wind that seemed to carry his name away before anyone bothered to remember it. By sundown, the town of Red Hollow had already decided it was finished with him. They called him a traitor. Red Hollow was the kind of place built on borrowed land and borrowed courage. A dusty town wedged between two ridges of dead grass and stone. Here, men pretended to be law-abiding until fear gave them permission to be cruel. The gallows stood at the edge of the town square, a permanent, patient reminder that justice was quick and mercy was always optional. The man they hanged was named Elias Crow. He'd arrived in Red Hollow 5 years earlier with a worn coat, a broken rifle, and eyes that held too much silence. He'd worked as a scout for the U.S. Army, and for a time, the town respected him for it. He knew the land better than most men knew their own wives. He could track a rider across rock and sand where others saw nothing but dust. Until the night everything burned. It began with a scream, a sound that tore through the quiet like a knife. Then came the thunder of hooves and the sharp crack of gunfire. By dawn, the Western Supply Depot was nothing but ashes. 3 soldiers were dead, and a young lieutenant's body lay with an arrow in his back. The town's verdict was swift and certain. Someone had opened the gate from the inside. Someone who knew the patrol routes, who spoke the native tongue. Someone like Elias Crow. By sunrise, Red Hollow had chosen its truth. Elias did not run. That's what people whispered about later, those few who still dared to whisper. He was found sitting on the steps of the livery stable, hands on his knees, just staring at the smoke still rising beyond the hills. When the sheriff approached, rifle leveled at his chest, Elias stood slowly, as if the weight of the moment had finally caught him. "I didn't do it," he said, his voice calm, almost tired. But the sheriff didn't answer. They never asked why he'd spent the night near the depot. Never asked why his boots were clean of ash. Never asked why the arrows found bore the markings of a rival tribe from miles away. Not the local Lakota people Elias had lived among for years. Fear was asking the questions that day. And fear didn't care for answers. Watching from the edge of the crowd was a girl no older than 17. Her name was Ayanna. She stood apart from the townsfolk, wrapped in a faded blue shawl, her dark hair braided down her back. Her people kept their distance from Red Hollow, and Red Hollow preferred it that way. Yet Ayanna came often, trading herbs for flour, guiding her younger brother through the strange noise and stares. She had seen Elias before, not as they saw him. She'd seen him kneel beside a wounded horse, whispering comfort until it stilled. She'd seen him bring food to her camp during a hard winter, never asking for thanks. She'd even seen him argue with soldiers who spoke of her people like animals. And she had seen him that night, the night of the attack. But he was near the river, far from the depot, standing between two worlds, making a choice no one else knew about. Her fingers tightened in her shawl as they shoved Elias onto the gallows. He looked smaller up there. The sun caught in his dark hair, now streaked with gray that hadn't been there a year before. His hands were bound, but his back was straight, his eyes steady as they swept the crowd. They didn't linger on faces, except one. For a brief moment, his gaze found Ayanna's. Something passed between them, a look of recognition, a warning, and a quiet plea all woven into one. "Don't," his eyes seemed to say. The preacher muttered words about justice and God's will. The sheriff read charges no one had tried to prove. And the crowd stood waiting, eager to be done with it. When the noose slipped around Elias Crow's neck, the wind shifted. Ayanna took one step forward, her voice caught in her throat. The elders had warned her. The white man's justice was a storm. You could shout into it, but it would not listen. Yet her heart pounded so loudly she feared the whole square could hear it. She opened her mouth. The crate fell. The rope snapped tight, and Elias Crow was gone. They buried him beyond the edge of town, in ground too dry to hold flowers. No marker, no name, just another patch of dirt turned darker than the rest. By nightfall, Red Hollow drank to forget. But forgetting didn't come easy. The wind howled through the streets, rattling shutters like bones. Dogs whined and refused to sleep. And more than one man swore he saw a figure standing near the gallows, long after it should have been empty. Ayanna didn't return to her camp that night. She stood at the grave, moonlight silvering the ground, her knees sinking into the cold dirt. She pressed her palm to the earth and bowed her head, her breath shaking. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I was afraid." The ground gave no answer. But somewhere far beyond Red Hollow, the truth began to stir, slow, patient, and unforgiving. 3 days later, the first crack appeared in the town's story. A cavalry patrol rode in from the south, their captain carrying unexpected news. The attack on the depot, he said, had been claimed by a renegade group of white men disguised in tribal paint. They were smugglers who profited from war and wanted the blame placed anywhere but on themselves. The arrows? Stolen. The language spoken? Imitated. The gate? Forced from the outside. The sheriff just laughed it off. Too late now, he said with a shrug. Justice has already been served. But the captain didn't laugh. And neither did Ayanna, who stood just beyond the circle, listening to every word. That night she made a decision. A decision that would pit her against the town, the law, and the silence that had already killed one man. She would speak, even if no one wanted to hear it. As dawn broke over Red Hollow, a lone rider approached the town wounded, and carrying something that could unravel everything they thought they knew. And in the pale morning light, Ayanna stepped into the street, ready to break the silence that had already cost one innocent life. The truth was coming, whether Red Hollow was ready for it or not. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. See you in the next one. At dawn, a rider collapsed just outside Red Hollow. His horse, staggering, fell beside him, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the still air like a premonition. Ayanna was the first to reach him. She dropped to her knees without a second thought, pressing her palms against the deep wound in his side. Her face remained a mask of calm even as warm blood seeped through her fingers. A crowd gathered, their usual morning bustle replaced by a heavy silence. They sensed it, a feeling in the air thicker than the dust. Something more than just another dying man had arrived at their doorstep. When the stranger finally found his voice, it was a ragged whisper, barely more than breath. "They killed the wrong man," he rasped. "Elias Crow. He was no traitor." The words, though quiet, ignited a spark that spread through the town square like wildfire through dry brush. Eyes that had once been hard with certainty now shifted, darting from one neighbor to another. Whispers erupted, hushed but urgent. The sheriff, a man used to command, barked orders to move the stranger to the jail, to control the narrative, but it was too late. The damage was done. A seed of doubt, quiet and infinitely dangerous, had been planted in the heart of Red Hollow. The rider, who introduced himself as Thomas Reed, a cavalry private, was consumed by fever. Yet, his memory was a sharp, unwavering blade. He had ridden alongside Elias Crow. He recounted how Elias had tried to warn the soldiers, how he had desperately fought to keep the fortress gate from being opened to the attackers. He told them how Elias, realizing his warnings were ignored, had ridden out alone into the suffocating darkness, a solitary figure drawing the enemy away from the fort, away from his comrades. "He saved lives," Thomas said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength from the conviction of his words. "He saved my life." There were no cheers in the square. No one stepped forward with an apology. There was only a profound, listening silence. The story settled over them, a heavy blanket of truth they had refused to see. That night, the very air in Red Hollow felt different. Lamps and windows burned long past their usual hour. In the saloon, drinks sat untouched on the bar. Men lay awake in their beds, staring at ceilings that seemed to have lowered, pressing down on them with the weight of their collective guilt. The silence was no longer one of ignorance but of introspection. Under a sky strewn with cold, indifferent stars, Ayanna returned to Elias's grave. The wind tugged at her shawl as she knelt in the dirt, the same dirt where she had found Thomas Reed that morning. She spoke to Elias, her voice a low murmur, as if he were merely away on a long journey, not gone forever. "They are starting to hear you," she whispered into the wind. "But they are afraid. Fear makes them deaf." Her thoughts drifted back to that fateful night by the river, the moonlight painting a silver path on the dark water. She saw Elias standing there, alone, carrying the weight of two worlds, his and hers, on his shoulders. He had known what was coming. He had seen the path laid out before him, the sacrifice it demanded, and he had chosen it anyway. He had walked toward it with open eyes. By the third day, the abstract weight of guilt solidified into hard, undeniable fact. Soldiers rode into town not with accusations, but with proof. They carried stolen arrows, the kind used by smugglers, not the local tribes. They brought sworn testimonies from witnesses who had seen deals struck in the dead of night. They unraveled a conspiracy of smugglers who had disguised themselves as natives, all to ignite a war and profit from the ensuing chaos and bloodshed. Every piece of evidence, every sworn word pointed to a single, shattering truth. Elias Crow was innocent. The town's moral compass shattered. The sheriff, the enforcer of their flawed justice, locked himself in his office, unable to face the people he had led astray. The preacher, who had spoken so righteously of God's will and righteous punishment, fell silent in his church, his sermons choked by hypocrisy. And the gallows, that stark wooden frame in the center of the square, stood empty. It was no longer a symbol of pride or swift justice. It was an accusation, its shadow stretching long and dark over Red Hollow. Ayanna was summoned to the town hall. The men who had condemned Elias now sat before her, their faces a mixture of shame and apprehension. She went alone, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. They asked her the question that burned on every tongue. Why hadn't she spoken up sooner? Why hadn't she defended him? She gave them the simple, painful truth. "When my people speak," she said, her voice clear and steady, "you punish us. When we tell the truth, you call it a lie. You did not want to hear the truth then. You only want to hear it now because it has been delivered by your own kind." No one argued. There was nothing to say. They asked her what she wanted. What would justice look like now? Ayanna didn't need to consider it. The answer was already formed, a demand born from grief and injustice. "You will speak his name here in the place where you killed him," she declared. "You will say that he was innocent. And you will let me tell the truth, the whole truth, where everyone in this town can finally hear it." As the sun began its descent, casting long, dramatic shadows across the land, the town gathered in the square once more. It was the same place, beneath the same gallows. But the silence was different now. It was a silence of anticipation, of dread, of a reckoning long overdue. Thomas Reed, pale but alive, lay on a stretcher nearby, a living testament to Elias's sacrifice. Soldiers stood at attention, their presence a formal acknowledgement of the military's error. The townsfolk shifted on their feet, caught in the uncomfortable space between their guilt and their fear of what came next. Ayanna stepped into the center of the square. The wind, as if on cue, rose again, whipping at her shawl, lifting the dust from the ground like restless spirits, rising to bear witness. She looked out at the sea of faces, some ashamed, some defiant, some just afraid. She opened her mouth to speak, to finally give voice to the truth that had been silenced for so long. But not every man in Red Hollow had come to listen. Some had come to protect their fortunes, their reputations, their carefully constructed lies. As subtle movements rippled through the edges of the crowd, a new, chilling realization dawned. Telling the truth had already cost one life. It was about to be decided if it would cost another. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more tales that explore the difficult path to truth and justice. The wind cut through the square as Ayanna stood before the crowd, her shadow stretching long across the dirt. The gallows loomed behind her, silent now, stripped of its power yet heavy with memory. She could feel it, the resistance. Not shouted, not spoken, but alive in the tightening jaws and clenched fists of men who feared the truth more than they feared God. Ayanna raised her voice anyway. She spoke of Elias Crow as a man, not a rumor. A man who walked between worlds and paid the price for it. She told them how he brought food to her people during winter, how he defended them when soldiers mocked and threatened, how he refused to let hatred choose his side. "He did not betray you," she said. "He protected you." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some angry, some broken. Then Thomas Reed spoke. Propped weakly on his stretcher, his voice carried across the square, thin but steady. He told them again how Elias had tried to stop the attack, how he rode alone into danger so others could live. "He saved my life," Thomas said. "And you took his." The words landed hard. A shout came from the edge of the crowd. "Lies," a man yelled. He was half savage. Always was. Before the sheriff could react, a rifle was raised. Time slowed. Ayanna stepped forward without thinking, placing herself between the weapon and the crowd. Her heart pounded, but her voice did not shake. "If you must kill someone for the truth," she said, "start with me." The man hesitated. And in that hesitation, the soldiers moved. The rifle was taken. The man restrained. The moment passed, but its meaning did not. Red Hollow had stood at the edge again, and this time, it stepped back. The sheriff removed his hat. For the first time since Elias Crow's death, he spoke without authority in his voice. "We were wrong," he said. "And there's no rope strong enough to hang that truth away." The preacher followed, voice breaking as he admitted how faith had been twisted into permission for cruelty. No cheers followed, only silence, the kind that finally listens. At dawn the next morning, the town gathered again, but this time without fear. They carried lumber, nails, and stone beyond the edge of town to the unmarked grave where Elias Crow lay. Men who had shouted his death now worked with bowed heads. Ayanna stood nearby as they raised a simple wooden marker. Elias Crow, scout, protector, innocent. Nothing more was needed. As the sun climbed, the mayor approached Ayanna. "We cannot undo what we did," he said quietly, "but we can remember it." She nodded once. Remembering is where justice begins. Thomas Reed recovered slowly, staying long enough to place his own hand on the grave before riding south. The soldiers left. Trade resumed. Life moved on, uneasily, but changed. Red Hollow would never again claim ignorance. On her final morning in town, Ayanna returned to the gallows alone. The wind was gentle now, almost kind. She touched the rough wood and closed her eyes. "You were not forgotten," she whispered. "Not this time." As she rode away across the open plain, the town faded behind her, smaller than it once seemed, but wiser. And beneath the endless sky of the frontier, one truth remained. Sometimes justice comes too late for the innocent. But it still arrives in time to save the living. After the truth about Elias Crow finally clawed its way into the light, Red Hollow didn't celebrate. There were no parades down the dusty main street, no grand speeches about bravery or justice finally served. There was no sudden surge of pride for doing what should have been done from the very beginning. Instead, a heavy quiet fell over the town. It was a silence that felt too deep, too unsettling. The men who once swaggered through the streets now walked with slow, deliberate steps, their gazes fixed on the ground, as if the very dust beneath their boots held them accountable. Doors that used to slam shut with careless confidence now closed with a gentle click. Voices in the saloon, once boisterous and full of laughter, were lowered to near whispers. Even the piano player seemed to understand, his tunes softer, melancholic, as if he knew that unbridled joy had no place here anymore. Justice had indeed arrived, but it had come too late. And every single person in Red Hollow felt the crushing weight of that delay. Ayanna found herself staying longer than she had planned. She became a silent observer, watching the town wrestle with its collective conscience. She saw children, with their innocent curiosity, ask questions that made their parents flinch, questions they had no answers for. She saw the men who had once roared for a hanging now avert their eyes from the gallows, taking longer routes to avoid even glancing at it. The structure remained in the center of the square, a stark and lonely silhouette against the setting sun. It was no longer a symbol of law and order. It had become a monument to their failure, a constant, painful reminder of a life unjustly taken. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and orange, the sheriff found Ayanna standing outside the small boarding house where she was staying. He was holding his badge not pinned to his chest, but cradled in his palm. He turned it over and over, his thumb tracing its edges, as if he were seeing it for the very first time. His voice was low, filled with a weariness that went bone deep. "I wore this thinking it made me right," he said, his gaze distant. "But it only made me powerful." Ayanna looked at him, her expression unreadable in the fading light. She let the silence hang between them for a moment before she spoke. "Power without listening," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "is how innocent men die." The sheriff didn't argue. He just nodded, a slow, heavy movement of his head. "I'm leaving," he confessed. "This town needs a lawman who remembers that." And for the first time since she'd arrived, Ayanna saw a flicker of something other than guilt in his eyes. It was relief. The next morning something remarkable happened. The people of Red Hollow gathered in the square once more. This time there were no orders, no summons from the law. They came because they chose to. A silent, shared understanding passed through the crowd, and then they began to dismantle the gallows. They worked together, board by board, nail by nail, pulling apart the instrument of their shame. There were no speeches. No prayers were offered. The air was filled only with the sounds of their labor, the creak of wood, the scrape of tools, the heavy breathing of men at work. When the last piece was removed, They carried the wood to the edge of town. They built a pyre and set it ablaze. The smoke rose, thin and gray, spiraling into the vast open sky until it disappeared completely. When it was all over, the town square felt different. It felt lighter. The guilt wasn't gone, not entirely. But in its place there was a fragile sense of honesty. Before she left Red Hollow for good, Ayana made one last stop. She walked to the small cemetery on the edge of town and stood before the simple wooden marker that bore the name Elias Crow. The wind was picking up, whispering through the tall prairie grass. She knelt and placed a small, tightly bound bundle of sage at the base of the grave. She watched as the wind caught its sharp, cleansing scent and carried it across the plain. "You changed them," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Even after they killed you." She paused, a lump forming in her throat, her voice tightening with emotion. "That is a power they can never take back." With those final words, she turned and walked away. As she mounted her horse and rode out of Red Hollow, the vast, open land stretched out before her, a sea of golden grass under an endless sky, the distant promise of home beckoning her forward. Behind her, the town grew smaller and smaller until it was just a speck on the horizon. It would never be what it was before. It couldn't be. Years drifted by like clouds across the plains. Red Hollow survived, as frontier towns often do, weathering storms and seasons. But it was different. It was no longer careless with its judgments, no longer quick to condemn. Trials took longer now. Every voice was given a chance to be heard. And whenever whispers of fear or anger started to rise, threatening to cloud reason, someone would speak a name, a quiet reminder that echoed in the silence. Elias Crow. Occasionally, travelers passing through would notice the strangely empty space in the center of the town square and ask about it. The old-timers, the ones who remembered, would answer quietly, their eyes downcast. "That's where we learned the cost of being wrong." Far away, among her own people, Ayana told the story. She told it not as a tale of vengeance or hatred, but as a lesson for the young ones who gathered around the warmth of the fire, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. She wanted them to understand the world beyond their own, the complexities and the dangers. "That man stood between two worlds," she would tell them, her voice rich with the wisdom of experience. "And he died because neither one wanted to claim him." The children, their eyes wide, would always ask the same question: "Did justice come?" Ayana would look into the fire, a slow, thoughtful nod accompanying her words. "Yes," she would say. But only after courage finally found its voice. And even now, on that quiet hill overlooking Red Hollow, the wind still moves through the tall grass. And if you listen, really listen, when the world is still and the past feels close enough to touch, you might just hear it, not the sharp, final snap of a rope, but the truth, finally speaking, long after silence had failed. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing for more tales from the forgotten pages of history.